This is a session that I put together that I like to call Let's Get Functional, or the fast path to smart serverless with Spring Cloud Function and Azure Functions. And as Anastasia mentioned, my name is Mark Heckler. I'm a principal cloud advocate of Java and JVM languages with Microsoft. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, we should have some time at the end of this session, but if time runs short, then by all means, and of course, even if time doesn't, there's much more time after the fact than there is even within the session allotted time. So please do reach out to me. My company email's there, my private email's there, and best yet is my Twitter handle. I'm also on Mastodon with the same at mkheck at mastodon.cloud, I believe it is. The best way to reach me, probably the path of least resistance, is Twitter, but I do try to respond to everything everywhere. It's just that's kind of the I guess the center of gravity at this point. So with that, a bit about me. I am an architect and developer by background, obviously an advocate as well, obviously an author as well. I've actually contributed content and code to several books. I've co-written a couple of books. I actually solo authored a book, and that was something that I'm very proud of and am very proud of right now. Because it's, I feel like it's a useful perspective on all things Spring, on topics surrounding Spring Boot. I'm a Java champion, Java 1 rockstar, Kotlin developer expert, handful of other awards and honors that I truly appreciate. Still mean I have to get my own coffee, which is fine. I bring my own coffee everywhere anyway, so that's good. And I am a licensed instrument rated pilot because sometimes it's good to see the world from literally a different perspective. So there's the latest book. This is the latest one that I've released early last year on Spring Boot up and running. And everything in there is well, everything except for the data feed app is written in both Java and Kotlin. So if you'd like to look at one or the other, compare them, or just dig in more or less to one or the other, it's there. The book, of course, has a Twitter handle. So if you want to follow it on Twitter, if you want to check out the link there, you can get a free sample of O'Reilly Safari Books online and check it out. Or, of course, you can find it in most bookstores. So the plan for today. I love this quote by Leonard Bernstein, who is a former composer and the former conductor of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, who once said, "To achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time." And I think we have both of those. So let's get started. A quick overview of what I'm going to be covering today, because I don't like to just dive into code. I like to set the context because I think that helps all of us understand kind of where we're going with the session. So first, I'll talk about when to app and when to function. And by that, I mean, as developers, we have a lot of choices in terms of our deployment targets. And goodness, choice is good, but when you have a gazillion different choices, and that is a term, by the way, when you have a gazillion different choices, it's sometimes tough to discern when it might make more sense to deploy it in one way or another. And I've done some tests and have some things to share and kind of my rules of thumb, my guidelines that I use. But again, these things are fluid, and I'll mention and explain that, why I say that as we go as well. Then I'll talk about why specifically Spring Cloud Function and why Azure Functions, and then we'll just dive into the code to see kind of how it all comes together and how I go about developing useful functionality that I eventually will deploy to the cloud to use in a production environment. So for starters, any bit of functionality that we have can, as I mentioned, be deployed to many different deployment targets. So when we distill it for the purposes of this talk down to a function or an application, how do we tease that out? How do we make that decision? This is kind of my first step, right? And again, as I mentioned at the bottom, some caveats apply. There are certainly things that are blurring the lines now, and I'll mention those in a moment as well. But I start by looking at the functionality that I'm looking to deploy and say, look, is there a low time between calls? Meaning this service is going to be accessed, maybe overlapping, maybe it's 24/7, 365, just a continuous barrage of requests coming in for this particular functionality. Or maybe it's a very sporadic access of that functionality. So maybe once an hour something happens, or once a day something happens, or just infrequently. And if so, if there is not a lot of time between calls, I guess let me take the positive of that. If there is a low time between calls, there's a lot of activity happening and that service is used a lot, you're probably looking at an app. You're probably looking at deploying it to an application target on a cloud platform that is running all the time. Now, maybe If we back that up a little bit, maybe there's not a low time between calls. Maybe the calls are fairly infrequently, every few minutes, let's say, but they're long running. So maybe there is even then an overlap. So maybe if a bit of functionality is exercised every 5 minutes, but the calls take, it's a very complex bit of functionality, and it may take 4.5 minutes to complete the process of making the request and computing and gathering information and collating and manipulating it and returning it. You may only have a very short time between those calls. So uh, if it's long running, there's a low time between calls, then, well, actually, I'm following different paths. If there's a low time, if there's not a low time between calls, but it is long running, you're probably still looking at an application. If there is not a low time between calls, so if it's a very infrequent, let's say that once an hour call, and it's not long running, it operates and completes within a second or two, or maybe 5 seconds, then you're looking at a candidate function, because it's something that's called very infrequently and doesn't last very long. It doesn't run very long. And again, this is where we get into those caveats, right? Because we now have a lot of different options in various different cloud environments where you have scale to zero capability. So you'll have applications or containers that can be scaled to zero after a period of inactivity, which is great for the billing. But here's where you start to kind of look at, does it make sense from a warm-up perspective, and even then the billing perspective? Because even if you run let's say a container application, and you run it 24/7, are you saving a lot by having it scaled to zero in between those calls if the calls hit a certain frequency rate? So I don't want to give away too many surprises, because there are some findings that I will share as we go along, but certainly the lines are starting to get blurrier and blurrier, and within 6 months they'll be blurrier than they are now. But here is kind of my starting point. I think it's a valuable starting point, and then from there, you need to probably, if things don't look right, start tweaking and playing and evaluating different options. But this is, I feel like, a very, very good starting point. So why Spring Cloud Function? Why Azure Functions? And I'll start with the Spring Cloud Function part of that, because Spring Cloud Function gives you all of the capabilities, the developer first focus of Spring Boot and Spring Cloud capabilities. So what do I mean by that? Well, it gives you the power of Java. Spring Cloud Function is based on the Java function interface. So that allows you to take an incoming thing, right? Transform it and provide a transformed thing, a different thing coming out the other end. So the abstraction level is well, it's nothing, right? It's based on Java util function. However, it gives you the capabilities, the developer first focus, the auto configuration, the simplified deployment management, the simplified dependency management, simplified deployment options of Spring Boot. So it gives you a lot of power and capabilities while still maintaining a very, well, almost zero abstraction level. So that is a very powerful combination to start working with and prototyping with. Now, why Azure Functions? Because at some point you're going to want to get that to production. Any application, any function that you develop until it goes to production is an academic exercise. It may be a very interesting and very valuable exercise, but until it gets to production, it's not giving you any true organizational or business value, because it's not really being used. Once it hits production, that's where the true value comes into being for the organization at that level. So Azure Functions gives you a way to do that, to deploy globally, to have redundancies and resilience. And why Azure Functions? And this kind of ties back to one of those caveats I was mentioning before. Excuse me. Because with Azure Functions, you have a very responsive cloud platform built around that and behind that. So you can do container applications and applications that scale to zero. And that's where I said those lines kind of blur. However, based on my experience, the performance of an Azure function, even if you haven't accessed it for a long, long time, far exceeds, it's far superior to a scale to zero container-based deployment. So again, there are very valid reasons for doing container-based application deployments at scale to zero. However, Azure Functions, for that self-contained bit of functionality, I still think are clearly superior in most use cases. So let's code. We've talked about the whys and kind of the whats. So let's get into the details of the whats, right? I'm going to go ahead and close that out, and then we'll pull up our Spring Initializer. Now this is a starting point for building Spring Boot applications on the web. You don't have to use this, and I won't get into a lot of details on this, but I'm just going to use this to create a simple project. Before I do, though, I do want to kind of explain the context from an application perspective of what I'm doing. And I'm going to start by saying that I actually have 3 applications that I'm showing today. Now, 2 of them I have coded because I can't. Our time is somewhat limited. They tell me I only have 3 hours. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's about 30 minutes. So I had to choose, right? So this is a plane finder application. And what this does is it will pull a device on my local network, which listens for aircraft in the area. I told you I'm a pilot. So, I mean, this is my other love after development and coding. Software development still is my first love. And this is, of course, a very close second in terms of things I like to do. So the plane finder service will use certain defaults, and it will hit my device on my local network and pull in the aircraft that are within range and reporting positions. And then I want to use that to push values to different functions. And in this case, I have a couple of different functions that I have deployed. Well, I will have deployed locally. So I'm pushing out some aircraft information, and I'm pushing out aircraft position information that is being reported at that current time. So I'm just going to go ahead and start this now. And the fact that I'm not providing these URLs is it's going to use these by default and access the ones on the local network, which is what I want at this point. So I'm going to start that up, and we see that it is started and running, and that's great. And now I'm going to look at one of these, and this is our position application, our position function. And I have this configured to be both a Spring Cloud function application as well as the Azure function application. And position is a little more complex, right? Because we're reporting actual position information like altitude, heading speed, rate of climb, rate of descent, selected altitude, et cetera, et cetera. So this gets, this has some complexity to it, and that's good. We like complex use cases with real world data. So let me pull up, and actually I don't have this running, so let me pull up a terminal here. And move that there, and let me just open a new terminal and blow that up. There we go, and we'll center that. And what I want to do at this point is, let's see, just go to dev session repos and functional, and let's see, this will be our aircraft function. And what I want to do now is just run this using Azure Functions. Azure Functions run, and I'll get that up and running. And while that's building or running or starting, and what I want to do now is go ahead and build our third application. So I'm going to be using Java and Maven to create a Spring Cloud function application. The current version of Spring Boot, which is 3.05. I'm going to just change a few bits of information here with our project metadata. I'm going to call this our aircraft function because all I'm going to be doing is pulling in aircraft information and using it potentially for other things as from a feed from our plane finder feeder application. So we'll call this aircraft function just to give it a bit of a description. I'm going to use the current Java packaging option in Java 17 current LTS version, and then I'm going to just bring in the dependency for Spring Cloud function. Simple as that. I'm going to drop this on our desktop. There we go. And that there, I'll open that up. And of course it drops it on the other monitor. And we'll move that over here, center that so we can see what we're doing. And we'll open that up. I'm just going to expand this so we can see what we're doing. That makes it a little bit nicer. So close this, and then I want to go and open POM. Now again, I only brought in one dependency. That's our Spring Cloud function context, and that will work fine in terms of what it's meant to do. Start run, stop. But what I want to do now is I want to add the capability to actually run this so I can see what's happening for the purposes of the demo, right? So, so Spring Cloud function, nope, starter function. No, it's just not going to help me here. So I'm going to have to type it all by hand. Spring Cloud starter function web flux. There we go. And of course, you can use web for a non-reactive option. I just like using web flux because it gives me a few more capabilities, but it works basically the same for what we're going to be showing. So today, so again, do what makes you happy. But that way it'll go ahead and start and run and we can see it as it happens. So the next thing I'm going to do is go to our application properties and provide a sensible default so we don't have any port conflicts. I'm just going to start this running at 7071, which is the default for Azure Functions. We won't be using this yet as an Azure function, but I like to keep things consistent throughout the demo so we don't get distracted with weird things like that. And then I want to go to our main application here. Now, what you usually see when it comes to Spring Cloud Function are very simple examples, like you have a function and we're going to take a string and we're going to return a string and we'll just call this echo for the time being. And something like we take the string and return it. Or maybe you do a string dot uppercase, whatever. I mean, the cases are pretty simple at this point. I do want to show you what this looks like, so I'll just go ahead and start this now. And then I want to go back here and we see that we've got our position function up and running. This is where we'll be going to access it, but that's kind of down the road, right? We're not going to do that just yet. I'm going to go to the desktop and I want to feed this. Remember we have this running on 7071 and I want to feed it a value. So hello. And there we go. So we're getting something back. It's very low sophistication at this point, but I just wanted to make sure everything worked and show you that, again, that very simple example is a valid example. So let's go ahead and make it a little more interesting at this point, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is go and just create our domain model. So I'm going to add a class. We'll call this aircraft, cleverly enough. And it's going to be a pretty simple class for the purposes of our demo. Again, time is fairly short, but I do want to bring in the ADS hex code, which is just a hexadecimal code for the automated dependent surveillance broadcast, like a transponder code, right? I want to bring in the aircraft's registration number and the type. Pardon me. Now, I'm going to just fill this out rather quickly, and I have done different demonstrations where I, bring in the code generated here with the IDE, or I use Lombok or records in certain cases. But I'm just going to kind of go manual in this case today for this. I'll add another constructor with all arguments. And then, of course, I want to do my getters and setters. Whoops. I want them all. So we'll do that. Grab that. And then we'll go ahead and do our equals hash code and toString methods. Let's see, we'll do the equals. There we go. So we get our equals and hash code, and then we want to add our toString. There we go. Okay, so that's sufficient for the time being. All right, let's go back over to our main application class. I'm going to create another bean here, and this will be a function that transforms an aircraft to an aircraft. And I'm going to keep this fairly simple again. So we'll call this just AC, right? Keys are not lining up under my fingers this morning. Huh. More coffee, I guess, which I have, but I don't want to stop coding to take a drink just yet. So, so we'll return, we'll take our aircraft coming in. And then what I like to do, at least for the purposes of the demo today, is just show what we're getting in, right? So I like to also dress up the logs. This makes it a little more visible for us. Again, these are logs, so I guess you can do whatever you want. I'm doing whatever I want, but it is a demo, so remember that. And then I'm just going to return a new aircraft, and I'll take the inbound hex code, the inbound registration, and the inbound type. And then maybe if we want to show some kind of transformation, again, this is pretty simple. So type equals, okay, so that's admittedly not that sophisticated, but it shows that we are doing something, right? So I'm going to go ahead and restart this now. And again, this is kind of my process that I follow in prototyping and developing actual production functionality. So I like to kind of give you a little insight into the streamlined version of that so that you can take that and build out as makes sense in your particular circumstances. We are up and running. Let's go ahead and verify. Now I have to change this. Now that I have two functions, I need to actually specify which one I want to access. Before, since it was only one, the default was, hey, just use that one, right? So now if I want to, well, I probably should do this. I want to use AC, right? Wasn't that AC? Yes, it was. Okay, so I'm going to pass in an actual JSON file, a representation of an aircraft, and I'll pass that in, and we're getting that back. So everything is working as intended. But right now, again, this is just Spring Cloud Function. We don't have any deployment functionality yet, specific deployment functionality for a deployment target. So let's go ahead and work on adding that in now. We see that it works. That's a good start. So I'm going to stop that, and then we'll go to our POM. Now, we're going to be making certain changes to the POM. I do have some of these scripted again for the speed factor. So I'm going to bring it in as a live template. I'm going to include a thin layout version, because this allows us to streamline things for an Azure Functions deployment. That's just the version number. I'll be using that as we go later. The next thing I want to do is comment out this one. This was kind of an adapter that we used for a Spring Cloud function to run and stay open while we worked with it, developing it locally. We don't need that now. So now I want to bring in the dependency for the Spring Cloud function Azure adapter for Azure, and that takes the place of our starter function Webflux. Kind of a one-to-one replacement there. And then I want to also include our plugin, right? So this is the thin layout dependency for the Spring Boot Maven plugin. All we do is add that in so it properly arranges things so we can run that again in the cloud. I'm going to add in a plugin and then make a couple small changes to this plugin, because this is our plugin for deploying, and this simplifies deployment to Azure Functions. It just makes it pretty nice, and I have everything kind of already wired in here. I will say this, that there are a couple of files that are required for deployment, which are automatically generated for you, but I like to tweak things just a little bit, so you may not necessarily need these, because again, our Maven plugin will generate these. However, I like to provide a bit of additional information as well for those. So I'll show you what those are next, and we'll go through that. So let's see, do I have everything here? I believe so. If not, then I'll certainly find out what I've missed. So I'm going to go here and create another directory here. And we'll just make this our Azure directory, because what I want to do now is create a couple of files, our host.json, right? And then we will come back in a moment and also add in our local settings. So for our host.json, what I want to do is just have a couple of properties here. So we have our version, and it prompts you, so that makes it kind of nice for memory. And then I want to also add the extension bundle, which again, this will prompt you for the ID. It provides the correct ID. And then for the version here, this will give you the valid range it's expecting. And this works. This is sufficient for what we need. I guess I should go ahead and refresh my Maven build while we're doing this. And then I'm going to also create another file, and we'll call this our local.settings.json. And this is valuable when we're going to be running this locally, which we're going to be doing next, right? Before we deploy, or before we see it deployed and running from the cloud. So I want to make this where it's not encrypted, so we can use this just generally. Again, this is opening things up for the demo. And then I want to provide certain values, things like our functions worker runtime. In this case, we're going to be using Java, as you might expect. And then this doesn't give you any kind of hints. It's just the main class, but we will need this. And what I like to do here in my development practice is just go here and kind of shortcut this, because I don't like typos. And this allows us to go right to the source and copy paste without worry of typos. And that way I don't fat finger anything, and it all works. Hopefully, we'll find out. So this gives us our information that lets us deploy either locally and run it as an Azure function locally, or in the case of host.json, in the cloud as well. The next thing I need to do is go back to our code, because I need to add our function handler, a function component, which allows us to use certain triggers to trigger our function that we've already crafted using Spring Cloud Function. So the next thing I'm going to do is just create another Java class, and we'll call this our function component. Again, it doesn't really matter what you call it. I just like to keep things consistent and easily identifiable for me. This will be a Spring component, so it will create a bean upon initialization and place that in your application context, so it can be accessed from other places and from any places. And then I'm going to inject our function of aircraft and aircraft, and we'll call this AC. Again, doesn't really matter what you call it. I'm just keeping things consistent. There we go. And then I want to inject that. We can use that within our function component. The next thing I want to do is define a function name. We'll call this AC. And we're going to be returning an HTTP response message. And we'll call this AC function. And what parameters will we need? Well, we'll need an HTTP trigger. And of course, there are different triggers you can use on Azure Functions. So you can have things like a Kafka trigger, or a RabbitMQ trigger, or an Event Hub trigger, or a database trigger. I mean, several different things. I'm going to be using an HTTP trigger today, and I'm going to provide certain parameters here, like the name. I just am going to call this rec, nothing fancy. And then we want our methods. So I'll want a couple different methods. I want a get method, and I want to support post methods. And then I want the auth level to be anonymous. So anybody can access this, which is fine for what I want today. And then I'm going to make this an HTTP response message, or excuse me, request message. And we'll be receiving an optional, hopefully receiving an aircraft, right? We'll call this our request. And then we can access a context, excuse me, an execution context. I won't be doing that right now, but again, that's important to have access to as well. So the thing that I want to return is some kind of an HTTP response message. So I'm going to use the create response builder. I'm going to make sure we get a status of OK. I'm going to create the header here, and we'll specify a content type of application/JSON, and we'll build our body simply by calling our AC function, our Spring Cloud function, and passing it our request.getBody.get, which grabs that aircraft coming in. And then I'm just going to build that. And that's sufficient. Hopefully that's sufficient. We'll find out. So I'm going to just go here to our command line, and let's go to our CD desktop, aircraft function, and let's do a Maven W. No, actually I want to clean package. We'll build everything, make sure everything is working and in the proper place, and then we'll see what, we'll try our luck at actually running this. See what happens. What could go wrong, right? So we know that we have our plane finder feed working. We know that we have, or we assume we do, we'll find out shortly. We know that we have our position function that's running locally. And we'll see what happens when we go ahead and build our aircraft function and run it locally under Azure Functions. So functions run. Gives me a chance to take a drink of coffee really quickly. Oh, well, I evidently still have that running, so I probably should close that out. Let's see. So that, bring that over. That's 7071. Well, I skipped over this part. Let's see. So let's go to our application properties. I know I actually did set it for 72. 2. Now that is interesting. Did I just reverse those? Let's find out. So AC pause is 7071. And our position should be 7072. That's interesting. So what did I do here? Let's find out. So I have 7072 running. Oh, well, I'm running the wrong thing. That's part of the problem. So what I want to do is go to the position function, and things happen, right? So Azure, let's go ahead and run that. And while we're doing that, we'll run this. Always something fun happening in a live demo. That's how you know it's live. So while we're starting up our position function, we're starting up our aircraft function. I'm going to go ahead and open another tab. And just go there to keep things straight in our minds. And we'll ping our aircraft, we'll pull our aircraft endpoint from our plane finder feeder. Everything is running on 7072, 7071, and we'll see what happens. Now that worked, right? We know that worked. Things never break in live demos. And we see here that we're getting our aircraft back. And we see the nice little logging that I created there. And we see that our position is working as well. And we see there that I also have the little position thing on our radar. So that all works. So now we have it all running locally. You're probably thinking, gosh, it must be really hard to deploy this stuff to Azure Functions, right? Well, that's where you'd be wrong, because we've already laid the groundwork for that. Let me go ahead and open this up and show you what I mean by that. Because in our POM, we already have our Azure Functions plugin, right? Azure Functions Maven plugin. We've already defined certain things like our resource group that we're going to be using and our region that we're going to be deploying to. So really, literally, to deploy this, it's just a matter of doing this, which that takes a couple of minutes. We don't have a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut straight to the chase, and we're going to start this up and start up our plane finder and run that and point to our cloud models and see what happens, our cloud functions. So I'm going to bring that over here. I'm going to stop our plane finder, and we'll start that again using some environment variables. So the first thing I'm going to do is just source our dev set Azure Functions. So now we have, if we look at this grep URL, we have a couple of URLs which point to a couple of Azure functions running in Azure, of course. So we're going to start up our application, our plane finder application, and just run that from there to point to the cloud-based based functions. So dev session repos, let's see, functional and plane finder. So now I will just do a maven w spring boot run. Now, instead of going to our local versions of our applications or local versions of our Azure functions, we're going to be running those and attaching to those and sending data to those in Azure. So everything's running here. Let me open another tab. You can never have too many tabs, right? 8080 / aircraft. And I'll go back over here and we'll see what happens. Let's see, there we go. Sorry, there we go. So here's what comes back. We see that we're getting back our responses. Oh, let's see. Service unavailable. Oh dear. Well, that's awkward. So let's see if I maybe I need to restart that. Something obviously wasn't happy there. Well, let me try one more time and see if this works. If not, then I'll just redeploy the position function. It's so simple. Not exactly what I had in mind to do, but actually kind of fun to show as well. So let's hit the endpoint, see if we get the same results. Aircraft. So that stopped. Ah, here we go. Oh, everything came back. So I'm not exactly sure what happened there. Something hiccuped in the ghost in the machine, but everything is working as you would expect because things always work in live demos. Maybe not the first time, but everything is working. We're getting back our positions. We're getting back our aircraft, and everything is just humming along nicely. So with that, due to our short time, I'm going to go ahead and stop now, and we'll wrap up with the slides, and then I'll take any questions at the time we have left, and we'll call it call it. So let me go back to here. So some helpful resources. If you want to go to the meta repo, it's called Let's Get Functional. Shock. And from there, I actually have the three repos that are part of the demo today. If you don't have a plane finder device in your house, it's polling for aircraft in your area, that's fine because the plane finder feeder that I created will look for that. And if it doesn't find it, it'll generate just sample data anyway. So you can still do everything. You can still use the code. Just a note on the aircraft function and the position function, there are two branches in the repos. The first one is just the Spring Cloud functions. You can go through the same process I went through and verify the Spring Cloud functions work. And then you can go ahead and wire in the Azure functions to see it deployed either locally so you can run it or ultimately to production, to the cloud. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback after our time together, here are my coordinates. Here's the Spring Boot book Twitter handle, and of course, my Twitter handle. Please do reach out, and looking forward to the time we can all get together and hug and have coffee together. So thanks for coming.